that nobody in Ilia Topuria's camp has been willing to say publicly. Where do you go from here? Not a victory taunt. Not trash talk. A genuine question, asked by the man who just broke him, about whether the most dominant fighter of his generation has a path back from what happened on that White House lawn. And the medical reality underneath that question is more brutal than most of the post-fight coverage has fully communicated. Start with what we now know happened to Topuria's body, because the details that emerged in the days following the fight reframed everything about how that night should be understood. He suffered fractures to both orbital bones, the structures of bone that frame each eye socket. Not one eye. Both. The right side took the worst of it. The fractures are non-displaced, which means the bone fragments stayed in alignment, which is the only reason surgery was not required. That is the best possible reading of an injury that, watching it happen live, looked significantly worse. But sit with the actual anatomy of what happened here for a moment. 2 broken eye sockets. The swelling that closed his eyes over the course of the fight was not surface damage from cuts and contact. It was broken bone pressing against soft tissue, physically forcing the eyelid shut, cutting off his vision entirely from the inside. Topuria himself confirmed the timeline of how bad it actually got. He lost vision in his right eye in the first round. By the end of the second round, his left eye was gone too. From round 3 onward, the man who entered that fight as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter on the planet was fighting completely blind. No depth perception. No peripheral vision. Nothing but instinct, the sound of his corner shouting instructions, and whatever his body remembered from a decade of training. Think about what that actually requires. Continuing to compete at the highest level of professional violence with no visual information whatsoever, relying entirely on reflex and muscle memory against an opponent who could see exactly where to hit him. The medical intervention that almost happened in the third round deserves direct examination because it reveals something uncomfortable about how this sport handles its own safety mechanisms. The ringside physician looked at Topuria's face after 3 rounds and determined he had seen enough, that the fight needed to stop. Topuria looked back at that doctor and told him no. And the fight continued. In almost any other professional sporting context, a credentialed physician identifying a serious risk to an athlete's health results in an immediate stoppage regardless of what the athlete wants. In MMA, apparently, a fighter's own refusal carries enough institutional weight to override that medical judgment, at least for 1 additional round. Whether that reflects something admirable about the warrior culture this sport is built on, or something the sport needs to examine about how much authority injured fighters should have over their own continued exposure to damage, is a question worth sitting with honestly rather than rushing past. By the 4th round, both of Topuria's eyes were completely shut. Not narrowed. Not limited. Closed. And Gaethje, who had every competitive reason to press the advantage at that point, did not ease off. The round ended with a crushing knee to Topuria's ribs as he was working his way back up from the canvas, a finishing detail that closed out a sequence that had already been decided long before the official stoppage came. It was at that point, according to reports, that Topuria's own brother, someone in his corner who understands him better than almost anyone in that arena, urged officials to end the fight. When your own family is the one pushing for the stoppage, that tells you something about how visible the danger had become from outside the cage, even as Topuria himself continued insisting he could go on. Dana White's comments immediately after the fight were unusually direct for someone running the promotion that just generated this outcome. He said they got Topuria out of the Octagon before his hand was even raised and sent him straight to the hospital. He said Topuria's eye looked like a probable broken orbital, and he was right, except it turned out to be both. White is not a man who typically undersells his own product, and the urgency in how he described getting Topuria immediate medical attention, ahead of any of the usual post-fight ceremony, says something about what people in that arena were actually seeing in real time that the broadcast cameras did not fully capture. To understand why this loss carries the specific weight it does, you have to understand what Topuria actually built to arrive at that lawn, because the path was never simple, and the story underneath the undefeated record explains why this moment is being treated as something larger than a single fight result. He was born in Germany to Georgian parents who had fled conflict in the Caucasus. When he was 7, the family moved back to Georgia, and it was there, on the wrestling mats of the Greco-Roman tradition that runs through Georgian national identity, that his athletic life actually began. After the Russo-Georgian War in 2008, the family relocated again, this time to Alicante on Spain's eastern coast. 3 countries before the age of 15. 3 languages. 3 sets of schools and gyms and neighborhoods, none of them permanent. He has talked openly about a difficult childhood in Georgia, older kids extorting him for money at school, the specific feeling of being small and powerless and unable to defend himself. That experience is the actual origin point of everything that followed. Not the highlight reels. The kid who decided that vulnerability would never define him again. He found his way to Clementi Club in Alicante, a gym founded by Argentinian brothers who had brought Brazilian jiu-jitsu to the region and recognized something in the Georgian teenager who walked through their doors. He trained there for more than a decade. In 2018, he and his brother Alexander became the first Georgians to earn Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belts. The nickname El Matador was born in that same gym, earned through the patient, precise, lethal way he worked his way toward finishes, a name he grew into over time rather than embraced immediately. He entered the UFC in October 2020 and simply did not lose. 8 straight wins. A reputation-building fight by fight for power and technical precision, including a moment against Jai Herbert in 2022 where he got dropped hard, climbed off the canvas, and finished Herbert anyway, the kind of moment that tells you something about a fighter's actual character under duress. By early 2024, he had earned a shot at Alexander Volkanovski, widely considered the greatest featherweight in the sport's history. Topuria spent the entire fight week publicly promising a second-round knockout. He delivered exactly that. Then came Max Holloway, defending his belt for the first time, finishing him by knockout in the 3rd round, the first knockout loss of Holloway's entire career. Then the move up to lightweight, vacating his featherweight title to challenge Charles Oliveira for the vacant belt, finishing him in 2 minutes and 27 seconds of the 1st round to become a 2-division champion while still completely undefeated. No fighter in UFC history had ever accomplished that specific combination. 17-0. 3 former champions finished in succession. The most dominant run the lightweight division had seen in years. That is what walked onto the White House lawn as a massive betting favorite. And that is what Justin Gaethje, using nothing more exotic than a jab, the most fundamental punch in the entire sport, the first thing every fighter learns in their first week of training, began systematically dismantling from the opening minutes of round 1. Gaethje later said he sensed the shift happening after he opened a cut around Topuria's eye with an uppercut in that 1st round. That single moment, according to Gaethje himself, changed the entire trajectory of the fight before most viewers had any sense that something had shifted. There is a layer to this story that exists entirely outside the cage and deserves acknowledgement, because it complicates any simple reading of what happened on fight night. In June of 2025, Topuria had announced he would not compete during the early months of 2026 for personal reasons. It later became public that he was navigating a difficult separation from his former partner, with whom he shares a daughter who turns 2 this summer. His relocation to Florida was partly about being closer to her. During the divorce proceedings, his former partner made allegations of domestic abuse, which Topuria denied directly and characterized as an extortion attempt. The lawsuit was eventually withdrawn after a settlement between both parties. This is a man who, heading into what he has described as one of the best training camps of his career, was simultaneously managing a custody situation and a public legal dispute involving serious allegations. He stepped onto that lawn carrying all of that weight, in front of the American president, and still walked away with a broken face and an ambulance ride. The scorecards do not capture any of that context. They probably should not have to. But understanding it changes how you read everything that happened that night. Gaethje's position on a rematch has been direct in a way that Topuria's camp has not yet publicly countered. He said definitely not a rematch right now, that he made Topuria quit on the stool, that the fight was 3 rounds to 1 on any honest scorecard, and that, in his words, that is domination in any election. He said it with what sounded like genuine respect for Topuria as a competitor, not cruelty. But the underlying message is unambiguous. He does not believe he owes a second fight to a man he beat decisively. Topuria's own public statement after the loss was exactly what you would expect from a fighter built the way he has described himself his entire career. He said he will heal, rest, and return stronger, wiser, and more dangerous. He said the story between them is far from over and that the rematch will happen. That is the kind of statement that ends up on gym walls. It may also turn out to be true. He is 29 years old, the fractures do not require surgery, and this sport has a long history of fighters who absorbed devastating losses and rebuilt into something more formidable on the other side. But it is equally true that this sport is full of fighters who said those exact words after a career-altering loss and never fully returned to where they were. The orbital bones will heal. But but the bone at the break site remains structurally weaker permanently. Every future strike that lands in that same area carries elevated risk going forward, for the rest of his career, regardless of how completely the fracture heals. The belt is gone. The undefeated record is gone. And somewhere in recovery right now, Ilia Topuria is sitting with something he has never had to process before in his professional life: genuine uncertainty about what comes next. Justin Gaethje asked the question publicly. Dana White danced carefully around it in his own comments. And the entire sport is now watching to see whether Topuria himself, recovering with both eyes still healing, actually has an answer.